Boston, March 18, 1990. In the early hours of the morning, two men approached the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. They were dressed as police officers, and when the security guard heard them at the entrance, they claimed they were responding to a disturbance. The guard opened the door. That decision would become one of the most consequential mistakes in the history of American art crime. Because once the men were inside, they subdued the security guards and began moving through the museum. For the next 81 minutes, they would take 13 works of art. Then they disappeared. More than 3 decades later, the paintings are still missing, and one of America's most infamous art heists remains unsolved. To understand why this crime became so extraordinary, you first have to understand the place that was targeted. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum wasn't designed simply as a building where paintings were stored. It was created as an experience. Isabella Stewart Gardner was a wealthy American art collector who built a collection spanning centuries and cultures. When the museum opened to the public in 1903, Gardner had created something deeply personal. The building itself was part of the collection. Paintings, sculptures, furniture, architecture, and gardens were arranged according to her vision. Every room had its own atmosphere. Every object had its place. And then, on one night in 1990, someone walked into that carefully constructed world and removed pieces from it. Today, visitors can still see the consequences. Large, ornate frames remain hanging on the walls, but the paintings that once occupied them are gone. It was approximately 1:24 in the morning. The museum was closed. Only security personnel were inside. Then the night bell rang. 2 men stood outside. They appeared to be police officers. According to the museum's account, they said they were responding to a disturbance. The security guard allowed them through the employee entrance. But there was one problem. They weren't supposed to be there. The men quickly took control of the security personnel. The guards were led to the basement and restrained. And with the security staff under their control, the 2 men were free to move through the museum. They now had something most burglars could only dream about: time, access, and a museum filled with priceless works of art. The thieves moved into the museum's galleries. One of the most important rooms was the Dutch room. It contained some of the most valuable works in the entire collection. Among them was a painting by Johannes Vermeer. It was called The Concert. There were also important works by Rembrandt, including Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee. The thieves did not simply grab whatever they could carry. They selected specific objects. They removed paintings from the walls. And in doing so, they created something that would become one of the most haunting images of the entire case: empty frames. The frames remained. The masterpieces did not. In total, 13 works were stolen. Among them were 3 works by Rembrandt, including The Concert by Vermeer, several works by Edgar Degas, Édouard Manet's Chez Tortoni, a landscape by Govert Flinck, an ancient Chinese bronze vessel, and a Napoleonic eagle finial. But one painting has become particularly famous: Rembrandt's Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee. It was not simply another painting. It was Rembrandt's only known seascape. And then there was Vermeer's The Concert. Vermeer produced very few paintings during his lifetime. Today, only a small number of his works are known to exist. The loss of even one is extraordinary. But on this night, both were taken. 13 objects disappeared from one museum, and investigators were left trying to understand why these particular works had been chosen. Perhaps the strangest thing about the Gardner theft is what the thieves left behind: the frames. Instead of replacing the missing paintings with reproductions, the museum eventually chose to leave the empty frames on display. They became a kind of visual memorial. Visitors could stand in front of the empty spaces and see exactly where the stolen masterpieces had once hung. Imagine walking through a museum. You see an enormous frame. You expect a painting, but there is nothing there. Only an empty rectangle surrounded by ornate gold. The absence becomes the exhibit, and decades later, those empty frames remain one of the clearest reminders that the theft was never resolved. For approximately 81 minutes, the thieves remained inside the museum. Then, around 2:45 in the morning, they left. They reportedly made 2 trips to their vehicle. And then they were gone. The museum had been robbed. The guards were still restrained. 13 works of art had disappeared, and the thieves had managed to leave without being stopped. But the crime wasn't discovered immediately. The security guards remained restrained until police arrived later that morning. When investigators entered the museum, they were confronted with a scene that would become legendary in the world of art crime. Empty walls, empty frames, and an enormous mystery. The FBI eventually became deeply involved in the investigation. The stolen works were entered into databases used to identify and recover stolen cultural property. Investigators followed leads across the United States and around the world. But the paintings proved extraordinarily difficult to recover. The stolen works were valuable, but their value also created a problem. They were too recognizable to simply sell openly. Anyone attempting to move them through legitimate channels would risk attracting attention. So the question became, where could 13 famous works of art disappear to? Were they being hidden? Had they been sold? Were they being used as leverage? Or had they simply been moved from place to place for decades? Investigators have pursued numerous leads over the years, but the paintings have remained missing. One of the most intriguing aspects of the case is that investigators have continued to uncover pieces of information long after the original crime. In 2015, the FBI released historical surveillance footage connected to the investigation. The footage showed an unidentified visitor entering the museum through the same rear entrance that the thieves later used. The visit occurred approximately 24 hours before the heist. The FBI released the footage in the hope that someone could identify the individual or the vehicle. It was another reminder that even decades later, investigators were still searching for connections. The case had not simply disappeared into history. It was still being investigated. This is where the mystery becomes even more difficult. 13 works were stolen. Some are among the most recognizable pieces of missing art in the world, and yet none has been recovered. The FBI has stated that the stolen works were separated after the robbery and could potentially be anywhere in the world. That creates a problem unlike an ordinary theft. A stolen car can be identified by its license plate. A stolen painting can be hidden for years. And if someone knows exactly what they have, they also know exactly what kind of attention selling it could attract. So the paintings may exist somewhere, in a private location, in a hidden collection, or somewhere investigators have not yet discovered. The truth is that no one publicly knows for certain, and that uncertainty is what has kept the Gardner mystery alive. The museum has continued its search, and the reward has grown. Today, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum offers a reward of up to $10 million for information leading to the return of the stolen artwork in good condition. That means someone somewhere could potentially know something that investigators have been waiting more than 3 decades to hear. A name, a location, a conversation, a piece of information that finally explains where the paintings went. But until that information appears, the empty frames remain, waiting. 36 years after the theft, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum still carries the evidence of what happened that night. The empty frames are still there. The missing works are still listed. And the investigation continues. 2 men entered a museum disguised as police officers. They controlled the guards. They spent approximately 81 minutes inside. They took 13 works of art, and somehow they disappeared. The paintings have never been recovered. So perhaps the biggest question isn't simply, who stole the art? It's this: where is it now? Until that question is answered, the empty frames at the Gardner Museum will remain exactly what they were meant to be. A reminder that some mysteries don't disappear with time. They become legends. This is Beyond Motive.